Welcome back to the Rooted HomeLife Podcast, where we talk all about cultivating home and chasing adventure with our children. Today's guest is very special and someone who I have followed and looked up to for a long time. All things motherhood, homeschooling, adventuring, and faith. You may know her as Ma and Pa Modern over on Instagram. You may know her from her book, Adventuring Together. You may know her from the Greta Eskridge podcast. Today's episode, I am sitting down with Greta Eskridge to talk all about her new book, It's Time to Talk to Your Kids About Porn. I realize that this is a touchy subject. I realize that this is a subject that many of us are not comfortable talking about, but I think you will find as we sit down and chat today that is precisely why Greta chose to write this book. So join me today as I sit down with Greta to talk all about this very important topic. Hi, Greta. Thank you so much for coming on to chat with me today.
Oh, it's so fun. I'm so glad to get to talk to you.
I know, it's like we're becoming best friends or something now. It's like
it's awesome.
Weird. Like we met twice for yours. Now here we are again. Like just, yeah, it's a budding friendship. But anyways, I just am so excited for everyone to meet you if somehow they don't know you yet. If you don't know Greta, this is Greta Eskridge. She is absolutely amazing. I have been following her for years now on social media. I've had the pleasure of getting the opportunity to hear her speak in person. I read her book, Adventuring Together, which was a huge inspiration for me and my adventures. And I am so excited not only to get to talk to her again, but to get to talk about the very important topic that she is passionate about. So Greta, can you just share a little bit about yourself for the listeners that may not know you or know much about you?
Sure. And your intro was so nice. Thank you. I am, let's see. So I'm a second generation homeschooler. I was homeschooled in the 80s and early 90s, and I loved it so much that after I did a stint as a public high school teacher, I became a homeschooling mom, and we have 4 kids ranging in age from 20 to 13. They've all been homeschooled. 2 are still being homeschooled. And I absolutely loved it. It's been one of the greatest joys of my life to be home with my kids. And I wouldn't trade it for the world. I'm also a writer and a speaker and a podcaster, and I don't know how I have time for any of it. So if people ask me all the time, how do you do all of that? I'm like, probably pretty badly, actually. I'm just barely managing to get by in every part of my life. But I have a lot of fun and I like all of it. Have written 3 books. My 3rd comes out first week of March. So real soon. And I love nature. My happiest place is outside, having an adventure, hiking, going to the tide pools. I love coffee. I love reading. I love my husband. We've been married for almost 27 years. And that is kind of where we are right now.
I love all of that. I definitely so relate to the answer of like, I have no idea. And I haven't written a book, obviously, and I'm not writing a book, but I totally relate to the feelings of like, yeah, I don't know if I'm doing any of this well. I'm just winging it. And you've gotten to see a little bit of that even with the podcast. So thank you for sharing that. 3rd book, which is a huge deal and so exciting. I mentioned that I read Adventuring Together, and it's honestly one of my favorite books. Like it really inspired me so much. Your 3rd book now is completely unrelated to Adventuring Together.
So different.
Whoa, okay.
There's a relation. There is a connection.
Greta's new book that is coming out is It's Time to Talk to Your Kids About Porn. And so I have so many questions for Greta, but I really want to hear about the connection first.
Okay. So my first book, Adventuring Together, it's about creating connection through adventure. So I always tell people like adventure is what we get caught up in and we're like, oh, that's the most important part. But really adventure is the vehicle, but the goal is connection. And so it seems like just a wild out of the blue that I'm going to write a book about pornography and how to protect kids from it. But I would say that there is a relationship between connection and pornography. And that is that pornography is a destroyer of connection. It absolutely creates disconnection, isolation, loneliness, depression. And so my goal is always, how can I help families cultivate connection, whether in a positive way through adventure or by addressing something that is creating tremendous amounts of disconnection amongst families and between spouses and between parents and kids, between kids and other kids, and in their future relationships if they continue with pornography. So how can I help them address that so that they can continue pursuing positive connection, which is, I think, one of the most beautiful parts of humanity and how God created us to be in connection and relationship with one another. And pornography destroys that. So I am against it, heart and soul.
So I stand completely corrected. It is totally related. That's amazing. So, I wanted to have you on the podcast anyway. Before I even knew that this book was coming out, we had chatted about it.
Yeah.
And I knew that there would be a variety of different topics that would be amazing to hear from you about.
Yeah.
And when I saw the book release, I was like, oh, that's the topic we're talking about on the podcast. Like, that's decided. Obviously, I asked you if that was okay with you.
Thank you.
But in my mind, I was like, that's it. And then I'm like thinking about it. I'm like, okay, I'm a new podcast. I'm coming out the gate with this like hard-hitting topic, right?
Good job.
But I was thinking about, I'm like, is it related? Is it relevant to what like I'm saying my podcast about? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely is. Like cultivating home, chasing adventure. So we could talk all about cultivating our home, making it beautiful in all these different ways. And then we could talk about chasing adventure for the purpose of connection and memories. But like, if we're not talking to our kids about the dangers of drinking poison, and like our beautiful candles and our read alouds and our muffins and our adventures.
They don't mean anything. Right. Yeah. Oh, that makes me want to cry. That's really powerful. You're right.
Like if we don't tell them like that thing, don't drink that.
Yeah.
So powerful and so important. So that leads me to my first question of like, what made you decide? Like, why was this your next book? Why adventuring together? Like I know it's the connection of connection, but like why it's time to talk to kids about porn?
Well, the book was a long time coming. And I would say the seed was planted in my heart to write it about 15 years ago. And that was when my husband confessed to a pornography addiction, which led to an affair. And those two things often go hand in hand, or some sort of illicit sexual behavior can be a result of a pornography addiction. And obviously it was devastating. It rocked me, my world. It rocked our marriage. It rocked my husband. And so in that time after time of healing for both of us, a friend of mine said to me, I hope someday you write a book about this. And I was like, yes, I want to claim that. And I want to share how God uses our story for good. And I mean, this was like a couple weeks in, and it seemed kind of hard to imagine that God would use our story for good, but I clung to that. And so for 15 years, I've been praying that I could write this book. The next reason that I wrote the book is for our 4 kids, because this is kind of a outpouring of everything we've done with them, and so much more, because I've learned so much over the years. And so it was like, people will say, well, why are you passionate about fighting porn? And I always say, well, there's 4 reasons. And that's James, William, Lily, and Davy, our 4 kids. They're like, I, of course, as a mom thought, well, how can I help our kids not have to deal with what we did? Right. And a big part of that was getting ourselves the help we needed so we could give them the help they would need. And it was not, we did not get a lot of help in this area when we were growing up, little to none, because the era we grew up in, nobody was talking about this stuff or very little. And so, I wanted this book for them. I wanted to write it for them. But then thirdly, I wanted to write this book for all the parents who were like me, who either shared a similar story, they were impacted by porn in their own lives, in their marriage, or with their own kids. And I knew they needed a roadmap. They needed help. And there was not much for me. I kind of had to figure it out on my own. And like, we're not at a time and a place where people can figure it out on their own. They need something in their hands now so they can begin talking to their kids, to give them the tools to reject pornography, to choose something better. And since I had all these years of learning and research and talking about it, learning about it, I was like, all right, well, all these things that have been swirling in my head and my heart for all these years, it's time to put it all in a book and put it out into the world. And that's why. There you go.
I mean, that's incredible, Greta. Like, I just think so much about how nobody wants to tell, like, no wife wants to tell someone, their friend, or definitely not the world, my husband had or has a pornography addiction. Like, so like the real
Yeah.
time has of when you were going through it, sharing that with
Yeah.
people close to you, and then like the
Yeah.
had of like telling the world, right? Like
Yeah.
there's so much shame and guilt associated with it. And like no
Yeah.
mom wants to
Yes.
say to anyone, I found out that my child is looking at pornography.
Yes.
Because it
It's
sounds like
extremely lonely.
you failed as a mom
Yep.
and now your child is damaged.
Yes.
So there's just so much stigma around it. So I'm just so glad you're talking about it, that we're talking about it. I feel like I've heard and read a couple times while looking through all of the, like reading the book so far, I'm up to chapter 2 and it's just been already so good. Um, the Unlikely Porn Fighter title.
Yes.
Why do you call yourself that, or why has that kind of
Mm.
stuck?
Yeah. I, for most of my life, would never even have imagined that I could utter the word porn or pornography in front of other people. I didn't even want to say it in front of my husband or like a close friend, let alone, to strangers on a stage.
Yeah.
Like I just read the book for the audio version, and I was in a sound booth with two strangers. And I was just like laughing to myself because I was like, I am saying the word pornography, sex, and a whole bunch of other words and concepts I can never imagine, like doing this in front of perfect strangers. And what has my life turned into? It's bizarre. I grew up really sheltered, and in a great way. I mean, it was not a bad sheltering. My parents did a wonderful job giving me a really safe and beautiful childhood, but we didn't talk about sex very much. We certainly didn't talk about pornography. And so to be now like pursuing this as this thing that I'm passionate about, it just seems bizarre. And honestly, I wouldn't have chosen it. Like I would way rather write about adventure. It's fun. This is not a fun topic, but what I have found is when I am willing to step into this place that and talk about this thing that is not fun, that is filled with hurt and shame and sadness and fear and pain, like just all these bad things. But when I'm willing to step into that place and talk about it, the opportunity, I'm going to get emotional, but the opportunity for hope and healing to come for others who were hurt just like me, just like my husband, like that is worth every bit of it. So I'm an unlikely porn fighter in the sense that I would never have picked this topic. I would never want to talk about it. I still can't believe I do. I have friends who call me the porn lady, which is like hilariously weird and funny. Like I can never imagine I would laugh about being called the porn lady the first time it happened. My husband said, "Did you ever imagine you'd be called the porn lady?" I was like, "No, this
Definitely
is
not. No.
bizarre." No, but God is big. He's big enough to change my heart, to make me not afraid anymore, not ashamed, and instead filled with compassion and love for people who are hurting, and with a desperate desire to help people avoid, if at all possible, the hurt that we experienced. And that comes from being a porn fighter, which I never wanted to do, but here I am, and praise God, he led me to this place.
Look at you go. So
It's so crazy.
I can't help but think about like how redeeming this whole thing, like how full circle, like the amount of lives that will be touched because you were brave enough to share this story and your husband was brave enough to share
Yeah,
it alongside of you, because essentially it's his story
it's
too,
his story.
right?
Yeah,
And like how many kids may not see it for the first time, or will have a mom that's prepared to handle it in a way that is filled with hope and healing,
yeah,
right? It's just like, it's just going to be incredible to see, or even just to know the waves of like how this goes out and touches so many families. And I think just so much about like what the enemy planned for evil, like God is
yeah.
using for good, you know?
Yes.
So it's just incredible that you guys are sharing this. And the thing that I noticed right away as I was reading, even only just 2 chapters in, is just how open and honest, but the hope, like
Mm,
the feeling of hope, like it doesn't have a tone of like dread. Like this
yeah.
dreadful thing has happened.
Mm,
Now we are all destroyed. It was like, here's the hope and healing that can come from this. So before I get too far ahead of myself with that, who is this book like most for, Greta? Like, who are you thinking of? Like,
mm.
when is it time? Like, as a mom, if I'm like a mom and I have toddlers, or if I'm a mom and I have elementary age kids, or I'm a mom and I just have preteens, like, when would I ideally be reading this book?
That is a great question.
Is it three
I
different questions in one? Sorry.
no, I love it, and it's so important because I think one of the most common responses to hearing I need to talk to my kids about porn is to be like, well, not me, not right now. Either my kids are too little, or my kids are too old. They already know about it, or oh, my story, like I can't talk about it because of my own past, my own story. We want to find some excuse. And so I'm here to tell you, sorry, there are no excuses. You should read this book if you have little kids, if you have toddlers or preschoolers, because you need to begin creating a culture in your family of openness and honesty and hope and not fear. And so this book will help you prepare for when your kids are a little older and you're going to have that first conversation, and the first of many. You should read this book if you have elementary school students, because that's the age where you need to begin having these conversations. And this book will equip you for that. There are actual scripts for you to use, because you're like, I can't have that talk with my 7-year-old. That's
Mhm.
impossible. Well, guess what? You don't have to come up with it all by yourself. I have a literal script for you to use.
That's
If you have
amazing.
middle schoolers or high schoolers, you need to read this book. Yes, even if your kid knows what pornography is, even if they've seen pornography, they need to hear from you what you believe about it and what they should do if they see it for the first time, or if they have seen it and you want to address that. So there are tips and scripts for you in those circumstances. And even if you have young adults, you should read this book, because your young adults, college students, they are so hungry for the truth about pornography. When I have spoken with college students and young adults, they have told me that no one's talking about it. It's
Wow.
rampant in their demographic, and nobody tells them that there's an alternative, that it's bad for them, that they should do something else. They are hungry for hope. So this is your chance to offer them hope. So, and then lastly, like if you're saying, well, my story, my past, my history, my mistakes take me out of this conversation. I don't have the right to talk to my kids about it because I've done such and such, or it's impacted me. Pornography's impacted me this way. And I want to say, you have a place here. I want you to talk to your kids. You are never out of the conversation. Even if you're using pornography right now and it's a struggle in your life, like, you know, the depth of the darkness, and your voice can be the one to tell your kids, like, God wants something better for you, something different. So all of that long-winded answer is to say it's for everyone.
Everyone. Yeah. So what are the key messages that you want moms or dads, right? Because it could be
Yeah,
the dad too,
totally.
to take away from your book?
I think the first thing is you actually have to have that first conversation. And that's the part where a lot of people get stopped because they just can't imagine how they would do it. And so, again, the book has tools for you, like actual scripts, things you can say if you're like, I can't come up with the words by myself. But you need to give your kids a plan for what to do if they see pornography. But that also means you need to tell them what pornography is. So the first thing that you need to do, you need to come away with is giving your kids a definition of what pornography is, and you give them the least amount of information possible to keep them safe. You don't give them details. They don't need details. They just need to know the basics.
Right.
And then what to do if they see it. And so that's your first step. That's the most important first step, is giving them a plan for what to do when they see pornography. And again, that's for your elementary school, middle school, high school, even college student. And a college student, you're like, well, how would I talk to a teenager or a young adult? But it's the same thing. And you need to be honest with them and say, gosh, I should have talked to you about this sooner. I'm sure you know what pornography is. You've probably seen it. And if you haven't, I'm so glad. But I want you to know what to do if you do see it. And other people might have told you what they believe about pornography, but I want you to know what I believe, and share that with them. And that's the first thing, is to have that initial conversation and then begin to create this culture of openness, no fear, no shame, grace, compassion, and creating a culture that has all of those elements, so that when your kid has more questions or wants to talk to you or has a confession, you're there ready to be able to talk to them and to keep moving forward.
So what would you say, Greta, to the mom who might be thinking, I can see that there are definitely families that need this,
Yeah.
but like, my child is well sheltered and protected.
Mm.
We
Yeah.
don't have access to any of those things. I have all kinds of programs on any kind of, computers, TVs, cell phones, iPads, whatever it is in my home. It filters out everything. My kids are always with me. Like, I know pretty much that we don't have to worry about this. They're not going to encounter pornography. So why bring it up?
Right.
And I can just let them be innocent.
Mm.
They're, if they will see it, it's not for way down the line. They're probably going to be an adult, because like, I've got everything locked down.
Yes.
What would you say to that, Mom?
I would say that's amazing that you've done such a good job providing a safe environment for your kid to grow up in. And yes, you want to cultivate that for as long as possible. But every expert will tell you it's not if your kid gets exposed to pornography, but when. And it might not be till they're after the age of 18 and they've left your home. But if you have not prepared them and they're 19 and they've never heard about pornography, what it is and what to do if they see it, they're going to flounder, and you don't know what their response will be. Maybe they're going to be filled with so much shame because of what they've seen, and that's going to be damaging. Maybe they're going to be curious, because that's a very normal human response, and they're going to return to pornography and look at it some more because nobody told them that it's not good for them. And then they're going to be filled with shame and sadness about what they're dealing with. So the reality is, even if we're able to provide this really safe, innocent, beautiful childhood for our kids, our job isn't just to protect our kids during the first 18 years of their life. Our job is to give them tools to live a safe, beautiful, intentional, and godly life for the rest of their life. And so part of that in a world that is filled with pornography means we give them tools to handle that for later in life, not just when they're 10 or 15 or 18, but when they're 25, 45, 65. Like, it matters. So I think that the thing that parents really struggle with the most when I share that is they're like, well, what about the innocence lost? And how do we, is it really worth it? And I would say, I understand that entirely. I mean, I remember having the first conversations with my kids, and it felt like a gut punch that I was going to have to do this. I hated it. And I was mad. Like, it's not fair. Like, it's wrong that we have to have those conversations with our kids. I wish we didn't have to. But since we do, we need to think of it this way. We don't send our kids into, to cross the street without us. We prepare them to hold our hand. And we say, you could get badly hurt if you cross that busy street without me. So I'm going to go with you. We don't just say, well, I don't want them to know that they could get hit by a car and it would be devastating, so I'm not going to tell them anything about it. No, you prepare them with your promise to keep them safe, to be next to them, and you give them the tools to be able to navigate that safely. And that's what I think about pornography. It's like, we need to give our kids the tools to navigate this dangerous thing as safe as possible with the promise of being there beside them. And does it take away from their innocence? I think actually less than we think. Mm. Because our kids don't have all the baggage about pornography that we do. We're thinking about it from our perspective. We carry this heavy, a lot of us, a heavy weight. Even if we haven't been impacted by pornography personally, like, just the knowledge of what it is feels heavy. And our kids, though, if they don't know what pornography is, they haven't been impacted by it in any way, then to them, it's just another word. It's just another thing. Oh, I got to be careful about that. Just like I can't touch the hot stove. That mom said I got to be careful. Okay. And so it's not as heavy and as destructive to tell them about it as we think. It actually would be so much more devastating for us to say nothing and then for them to suffer the consequences without our help.
Yeah, that last part is what I was thinking as you were explaining, just like how much more traumatic it would be for them to just completely happen upon it or be shown it and not have had any prior warning of its existence.
Yeah.
And not knowing what to do.
Yes, that's critical.
Knowing what to do because they've talked about it. So I was at the Wild and Free conference in Franklin in September.
Yeah.
And Amber O'Neill Johnson was sharing about an experience that she had where her child was prepared for that moment because of you. Mm-hmm. So she shared that because my friend Greta told me this is something that we need to be talking about, my innocent baby, who I would have never wanted to talk to about that, knew what to do in that situation.
Yeah.
So that's a prime example of not wanting to talk about it, not wanting to have to worry about hurting their innocence, but how much worse it could have been had her son not known, this is what I do if and when this happens. And he knew what to do, and he carried out the instructions.
Yeah.
So it's really powerful.
Yeah, it is. Our kids, if we equip them, they're so resilient, they're so brave, they're so smart, and they just need the tools so that they can do the right thing in a situation that could without those tools leave them really stranded. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just like one of the any of the other things that we would talk to them about, like stranger danger, right? Like this, yes. You do if a stranger approaches you. We don't talk to them about that. It could be much worse. I wanted to talk a little bit about two interesting ideas that you touch on in the book, being media literacy and pornified culture. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, those two things go hand in hand. So a pornified culture is the culture we live in, which is everything is highly sexualized. Pornography is minimized and normalized. So, whether you see that in commercials, like in the book, I talk about a commercial my kids saw for Triscuit crackers. And the commercial was, go topless, eat your Triscuit cracker with no toppings on top. And my kids were like instantly appalled. They were like, they're using sex to sell crackers. That's ridiculous, because they are media literate. They have been taught to identify the way the media is trying to trick them to use sex to sell something like crackers
Mm-hmm.
and to identify things like objectification and normalizing of porn, how pornography is just a joke. And when our kids are growing up in that culture, if we don't teach them to notice those messages, those agendas, then they begin to absorb them as the truth. Whereas if we teach them to be media literate, and to understand, like, this is the agenda that is being thrown at you, but you don't have to take it. You don't have to accept it as the truth. Then they are, I believe, more equipped to say pornography isn't normal. Pornography isn't harmless, and objectification of human beings is not right. And we reject that. And instead, we see every human as made in the image of God and worthy of respect. And I'm not gonna purchase a product just because you're trying to sell it with sex. I'm not gonna buy that either, that idea. And so when we give our kids those kind of tools, they become critical thinkers and they begin to develop things like discernment and discretion. And I believe it sets them up for, again, a lifetime of sexual integrity. And that is what we want. Not kids who are, like uptight, prudish people who think all sex is wrong and bad. And instead, that they're saying, no, sex is great. It's God's plan for humanity and it's a gift. But when it's twisted and warped and it's about selfishness and using other people, that's wrong. And I reject that.
That's so good. I was thinking about, the word perversion, which I've talked to my kids about before, and how it doesn't just relate to like sexual topics, although I feel
Mhm.
like it has, it's become that, but
Yeah.
really it's a twisting,
Yeah.
right? Like the perversion of something is the twisting of something to make it what it wasn't supposed to be. And that's
Yeah.
exactly what you're talking about here, where it's like, no, this is a beautiful thing that God has gifted husbands and
Yeah.
wives, right? And how the enemy has really just tried to come in and twist it to become
Yeah.
something really foul and really destructive and really
Yeah.
hurtful. And in the end, I also just want to connect that to one other thought, which is that there is not an underlying tone of the person that's been exposed or even addicted to pornography being the villain.
Mm.
And that's something that's like really stood out to me about the way that you've addressed this topic so far. And I would love if you could just maybe share a little bit about why that's coming through. Like as a reader
Mm.
and as a listener, like why do you think that's coming through in that way?
Oh, that is a great question. And I would say I agree with you. The person who has been exposed to pornography, even the person who is addicted to pornography, is not the villain. They're the victim. The villain in scenario is the pornography industry. It's the person who is creating pornography. And I would say not even the people who are making pornography. A lot of times they're victims too.
Mhm.
um, the pornography industry is full of victims, whether it's people who are, in the films, often they're not by their own accord, not, or they're trapped there. And then people who are consuming pornography. And that doesn't mean that there's no personal responsibility. Saying
Mm,
that they're a victim does not mean they have no responsibility and that they should not get help and accountability to try to break free.
mm,
But I believe 100%, and especially for children who are exposed to porn and return to it, they are so victimized. And I would say, oftentimes, adults who are addicted to pornography, it starts as exposure as a child. And so they are victims and it haunts them. And that's why it's so imperative that we talk about it and help kids and help families so that that doesn't become the cycle that they're trapped in. Instead of saying, to themselves, a kid who's exposed to pornography, like, I'm a horrible person. Mom and dad are going to hate me. I'm so ashamed. I've done this awful thing. And then they're stuck. But then they're stuck with, like, oh, wow, but it is, I'm curious about it. I want to know more. That must mean I'm terrible because I want to go back. But no one's told them anything. And so then they're just trapped. They're the victim. We need to help them. That's our job as parents. And so I think one of my favorite chapters in the book addresses this, and it's the chapter that I write about compassion, because I would never have anticipated that I would feel compassion towards people who use pornography, including my own husband, that I would feel, anger and hurt and pain. And yes, I did feel those things, but God replaced those with compassion and care and love for them, because I have been given an understanding of how dark the world of pornography is, how addictive, and how much hurt is in the hearts of many people who use it. And I want more than anything to give them help and a way out. And ideally, never even having to get to that place in the first place.
I have two final questions, if that's okay. The first one is because of the perception. Like, I feel like there's a huge gap in my perception of how this topic is perceived. There's either people who don't think it's a big deal and think that it is normal and okay.
Yes.
And then there's the people that think, like, if you are someone who gets addicted to pornography, it's because you are just a perverted person.
Yes, totally.
And so,
that is actually how I used to feel, honestly,
and
which is
so
embarrassing, but it's true.
in
Yeah.
the beginning of your book, you talk a lot about how much you dove into trying to understand this addiction and trying to understand, like, the science behind it. And while I know we don't have a ton of time to talk about that, I feel like maybe addressing the question of, well, how does one return to something that they could be so like disgusted by even upon seeing it if they're not
Yes.
like this sick perverted person?
Yeah.
Is there a way to kind of give us a little nugget of that knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, but I would say that pornography, because it's addictive, and because it relies on, like, one of the most powerful human urges, which is our sexual urge. Like, it makes it such an addictive, that makes the addiction power so strong. It also is often connected to a hit of dopamine, which is a feel good chemical. So it's a relief of stress, fear, anxiety, depression, boredom, feeling like self no self-worth, like, all of those things are often being experienced by a person who's using pornography. And so, like, it's not just like this sexual thing, like, that is a part of it, but it's also all these other things are wrapped up into it. And so when you get that dopamine hit, like that, oh, okay, the release of dopamine, I feel better for a moment. It feels like it solved my problems. And then the addict will tell themselves, okay, but next time I'll be able to not turn to that to make myself feel better when I'm feeling depressed, stressed, anxious, or whatever. But that is becomes this like a channel in their brain that is the way that they deal with those things. And so I think it's easy to say, oh, they're just somebody who has some sort of weird sexual perversion. And sadly, that can grow as a person becomes very entrenched in pornography. They can develop those. And that's another reason why we have to be really honest about the danger of pornography. But I think at the beginning, at the outset, and for many people who don't go down that dark really dark path. It is an addiction that is just a way for them to cope with other really difficult feelings in their life. And they've never been taught or given the opportunity to learn how to deal with those things in a positive way. You could say the same about a person who deals with their negative feelings through shopping,
Mm.
drinking, um,
Gambling.
gambling, gaming, exercise. Like there are positive and negative ways that we deal with negative emotions.
Mhm.
And then, like exercise, you would be like, well, that's a positive thing, but it can become negative. So, I think it's important for us to have a more compassionate outlook and a better understanding of why people turn to porn at the outset beyond just the initial, oh, I saw it and I'm curious because it sparked a feeling in my body that's like a
Right.
natural human response. But
Right.
then why do we return? Why would a user return to it again and again? It's much bigger often, and there are other things going on than just it's about sex. And
Right.
having that compassionate, and I think deeper understanding of what is going on in a person's heart and life, that is really helpful.
Yeah. It had me thinking while you were talking about like someone who doesn't from the outset be like, I want to do drugs, but then maybe they have some kind of injury and
Yeah.
get put on like an opiate for pain.
Yeah.
And then they end up being addicted to it. It's not because they're like,
Yeah.
well, I really enjoy drugs,
Right.
but it's that same thing in the brain, right? That like releases the
Yeah.
dopamine that they then
Yeah.
crave again. So,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah. And I think that's where the compassion piece is so important because if we can have compassion to someone for somebody who's hurting and who's hurting themselves, and even if they're hurting others, like
Mhm.
to have compassion, again, that does not mean that we're saying you have no responsibility and that you shouldn't try to change or
Right.
get help because you should
Yes.
definitely. But they don't have to be exclusive of one another. Like we can't say, well, I have compassion for you so you can do whatever you want.
Right.
And we don't also have to say, well, you need to take charge and change your life and show no compassion. Those things can coexist. It's hard, but they should, because I believe that that is the heart of God. He has compassion on us in our
Mhm.
pain and our suffering. He cares about us so much, but he also calls us to something better. Like that is what we need to offer, right? Like we need to offer what God offers to us. And so that's why that chapter is my favorite because I care so much about people who are hurting and I want to say there's something better.
I love that you pretty much took the words out of my mouth because as you're saying that, I'm like, yeah, and that's Jesus,
Yeah.
right? Like, go and sin no more. But it's
Yeah.
not from a place of condemnation, it's from a place of compassion,
Yes.
right? So, could you share maybe just one or two Bible verses before we go that really have helped you through this journey of
Mhm.
walking through what you went through and then sharing and encouraging others to start talking to their kids about this?
Yeah, I think one that was really powerful for Aaron and I, we at the start of our journey, um, we had just gone through a really painful miscarriage. I lost a baby at 13 weeks, and we were really grieving. And then the pornography addiction came out, and the affair, and it just felt like our world was falling apart. And miraculously, we got pregnant with our youngest, David, shortly after all of that. And
Wow.
we were at the hospital. I was in labor. And before we went up to labor and delivery, we went into the chapel and we were reading the Bible together and praying. And there's a verse in Isaiah, and of course, I'm blanking on the passage right now, like the whatever the location. I
Mhm.
can't even think of words. You know what I mean? But
We're in
it's
it. We're in the
yeah.
chapter. We're in the
I'll
book.
find it, and you can put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
Um, where it talks about God's promise, and He says, "I will give you streams in the desert,
Mhm.
and He will restore the wasteland." And that was like a promise that we clung to, and we have seen it's come true. And it like again, like it's hard work. It doesn't mean it's easy, but He you can walk through the desert and he will still provide water and streams, and he will restore the things that felt like restoration isn't possible. So I'll find that verse for you. And then the other verse that I love is kind of my mantra in this work, and it is from the book of Romans, chapter 12. And oh gosh, now I'm gonna blank on this.
Like, I don't know this one either.
Gosh, I should be so prepared for this, and I'm not. I say this verse all the time. Gosh, why is it blanking? Something about evil and good. Pardon?
We can add that one to the show notes too.
Okay, we should.
There's no pressure.
Because it's such a great verse and I'm so blanking on it. But basically, we are not supposed to here it is. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Praise the Lord.
Yes.
He redeemed the moment where I had menopause brain. But yeah, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Like, it's so tempting to be overcome by this and to feel like it's too big. I can't do anything. It's not worth the fight, but that is not true. God calls us to overcome evil with good. And so that is my mantra in the fight. And that's what I would share with every parent. Like, don't believe that it's the end. It's not. God is bigger than pornography. God is bigger than shame and hurt and pain. And he calls us to replace that with good. And that good comes from him.
Yes. And amen. So Greta, where can people get their hands on this book? Because I am fully convinced now that everyone needs to read it as well. If I wasn't before, I certainly am now. So where can they get their hands on this? What's the best place to find it?
Really anywhere. Like, it is Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Walmart carries it, Thrift Books carries it. Christianbook.com has a great sale on it right now. Awesome. And they've had for a couple weeks. So I assume it's going to continue. So you can find it anywhere, and that you want to get books, and you can go to your library and ask them to carry it. They'll order it. You could go to your favorite local bookstore and say, hey, can you have this book on your shelves? Because the more it gets in like those places, the more it's exposed to people who might not find it otherwise.
Awesome. And where can they find you? What are the best places to find you? So they'll find the book and then they want to hear more from Greta. Where are the best places to find you?
Instagram is the best. That's where I'm the most active, and my handle is Ma and Pa Modern, but you could just search Greta Eskridge and you'll find me. And so follow me there, and you'll get, a lot of this content, but also other things like tide pools and my favorite books and, what I'm having for breakfast. It's a hodgepodge, but it's a lot of fun. And then I have a podcast, which you guys, Christina was on my podcast, and you should listen to those episodes. It's just the Greta Eskridge podcast. And it's, where I talk about all the things that matter to me, chasing joy, and with people that I really admire and appreciate. So those are all the places.
Thank you, Greta. I will make sure everything is linked in the show notes for everyone. Thank you so much for talking with me about this and sharing this with the world. I can't wait for everyone's lives to be impacted by it.
Thanks for having me, Christina. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much for joining Greta and I today on our conversation about this really sensitive yet important topic. I hope you leave today's conversation with tools and resources and inspiration to think about how you yourself can begin talking to your children about this topic in a way that can protect them from the pain of the exposure to this evil in our world. Definitely check out the resources listed in the show notes, where you can find more encouragement, more resources, and more inspiration from Greta. If you enjoyed this podcast or any of the podcast episodes that you've listened to so far on the Rooted Home Life podcast, I would love if you would leave a review to let others know that this is a podcast worth listening to. I hope to see you again in one of our next episodes, and until next time, stay rooted.